So just to reiterate the format of the discussion, we'll start with Father Hummel so that the Imam can catch his breath and come this direction. So I just changed the order around. That's okay.
That's fine.
I don't think I see up and down the East Coast representing about 9 or 10 Roman Catholic dioceses, plus representatives of the bishops' conferences, several ethnic and language groups have been having a series of discussions about how we might better identify folks who come to the United States from other places, how they might better be. Now here's an interesting way of looking at the issue. Do you say inculturated, acculturated, or enculturated? The preferred term is acculturate, or acculturation. One of the things that is faced, that these gentlemen, because obviously the Catholic priests, they're all men, they're faced with is the whole idea of what is, to many of them, a little bit offensive, is called accent reduction. As one of them has observed, well, you have an accent. And I said, well, yes, I mean, I was born in Newark. I come from New Jersey. That's true. A preferred term for that, as we develop a little sensitivity and understanding, might be dialect coaching. If they're going to preach to a congregation in northeastern New Jersey, well, they better understand who Tony Soprano was. And by the way, yes, I have met him. Jimmy Gandolfini was a Catholic, was raised in Park Ridge up in northern New Jersey. His father was a janitor in one of the high schools I worked in. So I met Jimmy before he was Tony Soprano. But if you're going to look at diversity, let us look at the whole spectrum. And when you hear that word, what do you key in on first? Ethnic, racial, language, culture, religion, country of origin, political affiliation, socioeconomic status, location, family, disease and disability, marital status, age, maturity, sexual orientation, immigration status, just to name a few. You see, we are a very diverse country, and this is probably a fairly reflective group of many of those characteristics. Pick 2 or 3 that work for you. As I said, we are challenged right now because we have a new wave of immigration coming into the Archdiocese of Newark. We are, like New York and Brooklyn across the river, we are a gate of entry. So we continue to deal with all the issues that come with that, both within the Catholic Church and without. Because you see in the state of New Jersey, the Archdiocese of Newark, for whom I work, is second only to the state of New Jersey in providing social services. And we do it with a very diverse community. When you walk up to one of our service agencies, your religious affiliation is not the most important thing. If you have a need across a whole variety of needs, well then, just to give you a little idea, then I'll let the other folks introduce themselves. In the Archdiocese, we celebrate Mass every Sunday on the weekends in 17 languages. There are 16 formal ethnic different apostolates within the Archdiocese. We identify 26 different ethnic groups as part of the Archdiocese of Newark. That's just the 4 counties of Essex, Hudson, Union, and Bergen. We also deal with folks. We have a dialogue and a commission for inter-Christian dialogue. We also have one for inter-religious dialogue. Several of my friends are involved directly in that ministry. So just living and working where I do, we are deeply involved in this. Some of the other things you heard that I do, particularly with scouting and law enforcement, have reinforced my need as a Catholic priest for 32 years to minister to people of various faith groups or none at all. Particularly if you deal with cops, you find that that's a special subculture all on its own. And I was with them last night. We had a graduation from our police academy, and that's very, very clear to me today. So I'm delighted to be here with you. I don't want to talk too much. My colleagues have to speak because we're all religious folks that preach and we like to talk a lot, but we want to hear from you as well. So thank you for your attention and for the invitation.
That's very impressive.
amongst a diversity of religious beliefs. We are bound not by orthodoxy of belief, but by a commitment to be together in religious community. We are bound because we try to walk together in the ways of love. We do have principles. Our first principle is that we covenant together to respect the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The inherent worth and dignity of every person. And that doesn't mean every person who looks like us, every person who's got the same skin color as us, you know, every person who we like. It means everyone. And we also have a principle that affirms where we covenant together to respect the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And in that sense, we understand that all of us have one home, the earth. And we are all interconnected one with the other. If you are a biblical literalist, you might say, well, we have one mother and father, Adam and Eve. I don't think we have any Unitarian Universalists who are biblical literalists. But science now has really developed the concept that we are descended from an Eve, that we are, in that sense, all brothers and sisters. There's a Hasidic story, if it's all right for me to tell that, which goes like this. How do you know when the difference is how do you know when it is no longer night? This rabbi asked his students. And so somebody raised their hand and said, I know, it's when you look in the distance and you can tell the difference between a peach tree and a plum tree. And the rabbi said, no. And then another student said, I know, it's when you can look in the distance and you can see the difference between a sheep and a pig. And the rabbi said, no, that's not it. And he said, and the student said, well, what is it then? And the rabbi said, it is no longer night when you can look upon the face of every person and see that that person is your brother or your sister. Because when you cannot see that, it is still night. So this sense that we are all family, all together, all connected one to the other, means no matter what our differences seem to be, what our differences of ethnicity, of race, of class, of sexual orientation, of religious beliefs, whatever those differences are, we are still one and another, brother and sister. Early on, one of the early Unitarians, Francis David, who lived in Transylvania, 1510 to 1579, he said, we need not think alike to love alike. Now there's one Transylvanian king in history, one Unitarian king, I should say, in history in Transylvania, and it was during his reign that the Edict of Torda passed, and it was one of the first measures supporting religious tolerance. And he affirmed that in every place the preacher should preach and explain the gospel, each according to his understanding of it. And it went on, therefore none of the superintendents or others shall abuse the preachers. No one shall be reviled for his religion by anyone. And it is not permitted that anyone should threaten anyone else by imprisonment or by removal from his post for his teachings. For faith is the gift of God, and this comes from hearing. And so in that light, no longer was faith to be imposed, no longer was it to be mandated by civil authority. The faith that we have, that he said, comes from God, and who are we to argue with that? We need not think alike to love alike. Now, I will close, I think, with one other story. We have a social action advocacy campaign called Standing on the Side of Love. That was born because we advocate for the rights of gays, lesbians, transsexuals. And that's now expanded to where we've advocated for immigrants and their rights. Now there was a law, as I suspect most of you know, passed in Phoenix requiring that the state enforce immigration laws and requiring the police to check people's immigration status. And a number of Unitarian Universalists joined with others and went out there to witness against this. A number of my colleagues and fellow Unitarian Universalists were arrested. And the story that really affected me was a Unitarian Universalist named Mark Orderis. As she was being arrested, she saw Sheriff Joe, the notorious sheriff in Phoenix. And as she was arrested, she made a heart with her hands and she mouthed the words, "I love you, Sheriff Joe." A witness said he was so caught off guard, he looked dumbfounded, he pointed to himself and said, "Who, me?" And she said, "Yes." And he walked away shaking his head. Later she was asked why she had done that, and she said that was actually born of her own compassion, that she knew something of his history, and that he'd been, his mother had died when he'd been born, and he'd been shuffled around in a bunch of different homes. And somehow she wanted to let him know that he too had inherent worth and dignity. He too was made in the image of God. He too was somebody who was lovable. Now, that didn't stop her from being arrested, but I think that sense that sometimes we need to encounter hate with love and we need to affirm the lovability of one another is really an important message that I think most faith traditions are teaching. Thank you.
Dr. T.G., and my thanks to my fellow panelists as well, and thank you all for coming out on a very cold, blustery December day. Today is in fact the 8th day of the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, Festival of Lights, and we understand that, the Jewish people understand that as the first struggle for religious freedom and against religious persecution. Once the Greek Empire conquered much of the ancient world, they extended religious tolerance. It wasn't invented in the 20th century. And for a couple hundred years, Jews and others could practice as they wished. And this changes under the Syrian ruler Antiochus, middle of the 2nd century BC, as he tries to force the Jewish people to adopt the ancient Greek religion. And so we rebel. It's a wonderful coincidence. It's nice that we have this kind of gathering on this final day of this festival. And yesterday, as many of you know, marked the anniversary of the shooting death of John Lennon. Listened to the radio yesterday. They were broadcasting a lot of his music and songs. And Lennon wrote about peace and love and fellowship and harmony. In 1971, he records a beautiful melody, and the song is called Imagine. Any of you familiar with that? Oh, yeah. I'm sure we heard it a few times yesterday, though I know the younger generation downloads everything onto the iPod. There is still radio. Someone will define that later. It's not my favorite song. It's because of the second verse. John Lennon would sing, "Imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace."